So today we begin, I think it's lecture 27, and I have a feeling we're going to be studying together. God gives us health to do so till lecture 550 or something, but that's all good. And we're about to do chapter 35 in part 1 of the guide. And Rambam takes, as his usual course of things, he bounces around, which he said in the beginning is going to be his strategy. And he says, and if you remember, in last week, he gave us a whole talk about why you can't teach all the secrets to everyone, and why people aren't willing to, and how so many people are not willing to put in the work necessary, or they don't have the capabilities, they don't have the skills, or, so on and so forth, all kinds of reasons why the vast majority of people never ever get to know the kind of knowledge that Rambam is trying to teach us in this book. Now, so it gives you the impression that the perfect great people, who are few and far between, are the ones that achieve all this knowledge, and everyone else, they can go about not knowing anything, and they can go about not even having a grasp of the true knowledge of Torah. So, and that is a scary thought, because, does this mean we allow the whole world to walk around thinking things that are completely untrue? There must be something that we can teach even the simple-minded. And what is that? How do we do that? And Rambam immediately pivots in that direction in the chapter 35 that we're about to read. And it's interesting because on the one, at the end of last lecture, Jeff actually brought this subject up, and we kind of, not debated, really discussed a little bit the fact that I tend towards trying to find a more democratic, a more, what was that?
Inclusive.
More inclusive, that's a better word, a more inclusive interpretation. While maybe the Rambam wasn't so inclusive, maybe he was more of an elitist. So and in what we're about to read in 35 and a little bit, and in 36 as well, if we get there today, is we're going to get somehow we're going to be left with this a mixed feeling as we read through Rambam, and I'm interested to see what you guys think. A mixed feeling of how, on one hand, he seems inclusive, but then he seems quite elitist. And some of this might grate on us a little bit. So it might be difficult. Some of this might sound good. So let's see what we all think. But there's something else, too, that I want to bring up. And I mentioned this before, too. And this is a problem, a dilemma that all Maimonidean scholars have. And that is that the Maimonides that seems to have become popularized through the 13, principles of faith, and through some of his more very outspoken statements regarding faith and and how you treat people that don't believe in God, and being and infidels and so on, to people that deny God's existence, where some of his statements sound very, very very much like you got to believe these things, whether you understand it or not. These are the things that are the truth, and any questions of it sounds very elitist. It sounds kind of strict, and it sounds kind of anti-rationalist almost. And on the other hand, the Rambam of the philosophers and the Rambam that we've been studying in the guide of the Perplexed is extremely rational, extremely open to all kinds of ideas, as long as the ultimate goal is searching for the truth. And how do you reconcile the two Maimonides? How do you reconcile those two ideas? There's a few books out there that if you haven't read them, you really should. One of them I'm going to mention now, if I mentioned it already, fine, I'd say is Must a Jew Believe in Anything by Menachem Kellner. It's a worthwhile reading, because in there he does discuss some of the issues that I'm addressing now. And one of the things that we're going to get from this, the contrast between chapter 34, which we studied last time, and chapter 35, which we're about to study, is Rambam himself telling us why there's two Rambams, right? So let's learn how Rambam explains this to us, why he has these two different ways of talking, and why he presents himself in two different ways, because he's presenting himself to two different types of people. And so here we go. Let's do it. So I just wanted to give. I'm sorry. Oh, I forgot to mute everyone, but you have the option, of course, to unmute yourself if you want to say something. But so let's do 35. I'm reading in the Pines. It's page 79 in volume 1. It's part 1 of Mor Nevuchim, chapter 35. Do not think that all we have laid down in the preceding chapters regarding the greatness and hidden nature of the matter, difficulty of apprehending it, and its having to be withheld from the multitude, refers also to the denial of the corporeality of God and to the denial of his being subject to affections. Let me explain. These two things Rambam picks out as the two main things you really got to get, right? And denial of corporeality of God, we've mentioned umpteen times since we've studied together, and that is that that God is not, can't be described in corporeal terms, that God doesn't have a body, etc. And the denial of his being subject to affections means that there's nothing that we can affect God. We can't change God in any way, which actually is an extremely important idea. In chapter 55, we'll get there probably in a few months. Rambam goes into it in more detail if you want to look ahead. But denial of his affections is the beginning of understanding what Rambam's concept of prayer is, right? And Rambam wants to make it clear that we can't do anything that will affect a change in God. But he's just referencing it really quickly here, that the denial of his, don't think that just because I just gave you a whole speech about how most people can't and never will understand these things, that they also shouldn't know these two basic facts, because no, they have to know these basic facts, no matter how stupid you are, no matter how uneducated you are, no matter how unlucky you are in terms of your opportunities to become educated, no matter how busy you are trying to make a living and raise your family and do all the things that you need to do, and you don't have time to study. It doesn't matter. These things you got to know. It's not so. For just as it behooves to bring up children in the belief, just like it's important and to proclaim to the multitude that God, may he be magnified and honored, is one that none but he, right, is one, that he is only one, and none but he ought to be worshipped. You shouldn't be worshiping other gods. Those are things that are basic. We teach even the youngest child those ideas, right? So it also behooves us that they should be made to accept on traditional authority. We have to tell them, no, this is the way it is. I'm telling you this because because the people that know are telling you this, right? That God is not a body, and that there is absolutely no likeness in any respect whatever between him and the things created by him. These are concepts that anyone and everyone, even a child, should be taught and should understand. And since, even though they can't go, what Rambam is telling us, even though they can't or won't or don't have the time to go through the process of proving and understanding this, they still need to know this, and they need to know this by being told, this is what the people that have done that work are teaching you. So therefore accept it, which is a little difficult to us, because what he's doing is he's telling us that on some level, some people just have to believe, right? That sounds very non-Maimonidean, right? Just believe. Why? Because I'm telling you. Why believe me? Because I did the work and I know, right? And because that's our tradition. And that's what we've known all these years. That's what the Torah tells us. So here we have we sound like a very different Rambam when we're talking to those people that can't get to this understanding. But it gets a little deeper than that. So let's keep going. That other examples, that his existence has no likeness to theirs, right? It's not like, well, I'm here today, you're here, and Rambam and God is here. No, it's you can't compare the two. That these, remember, he's mentioning concepts which everyone should know and understand, regardless of their level of intelligence or education. Nor his life to the life of those among them who are alive, nor again his knowledge to the knowledge of those among them who are endowed with knowledge. When God knows something, it's not like we know something, and so on. They should be made to accept the belief that the difference between him and them is not merely a difference of more or less. It's not that God is, I'm strong, but God is much, much, much stronger. I'm smart, but God is much, much, much smarter. I know things, but he knows much more. That's not how it works. It's not just a difference in quantity, but it's one concerning the species of it. It's a difference in a nature. It's a totally different thing. I mean to say that it should be established in everyone's mind that our knowledge of our power does not differ from his knowledge or power, in his being greater and stronger and me being lesser and weaker, or other respects, right? Because strong and weak are similar. In other words, there's you and I might be a little stronger than you, right? You might be a little smarter than me, but we're both can compare because I have strength and you have strength, right? The strength is the same. How much I have and how much you have is different. But that's not how we should compare ourselves with God. Similarly, any relation can subsist only between two things belonging to one species, right? Okay. This likely has been made clear, fine. Now, everything that can be ascribed to God may be exalted differs in every respect from our attributes, so that no definition can comprehend the one thing and the other. So I can't make such comparisons. And so this concept can, should, and must be explained to everyone, no matter what. And this is the basis of the concept of the 13 principles of faith, right? When Rambam tells us that you must believe in this concept, right? In those concepts that he lays out there without explanation, he's saying, because I'm Maimonides and I'm telling you, this is the way it is. So listen, right? Similarly, I shall make clear the term existence can only be applied equivalently to his existence and to that of things other than he. This measure of knowledge will suffice for children and the multitude to establish in their minds that these are the things they need to know. There's a perfect being who is neither a body nor a force in a body, and that he is the deity, that's God, and that no sort of deficiency and therefore no affection whatever can attain him. Remember, affection here means to affect, to do something to that makes God change. That we don't do things on this world that somehow makes God change. As for the discussion concerning attributes and the way they should be, however, and this is interesting now, because Rambam's about to list things which he's going to do in this book for those of us that are the elitists. We're the ones that are in this class thinking that we're smart enough to get it, right? So what are those things that you don't have to tell everybody? Okay, these are the things that you don't have to tell everybody, and only those chosen few can try to achieve. As for the discussion concerning the attributes and the way they should be negated with regard to him, in other words, an attribute, if I say God is merciful, what does that mean that he's merciful? Right? When I feel mercy, I have a little pain in my heart. I might cry a little. I might go and do someone a favor or something. That's what I feel. Obviously, God doesn't feel those things. He doesn't cry, So, but what does that mean? That we'll get to, Rambam says. That I'm going to explain to you in this book, but you don't have to go through that with everyone. And that's for the meaning of the attributes that may be ascribed to him. In other words, the attributes which we have to negate regarding to God and the attributes which we give to God, as well as the discussion concerning his creation of that which he created. How does it work that God created a world? What does this mean he created a world? These are lofty concepts that you and I are going to delve into, right? But you don't need to go through this with everyone. The character of his governance in the world, how it is that God, what does it mean that God governs the world, right? What does it mean that God governs, what does he do? What does he actually do? Does he make sure that tomorrow I get to work on time? Does he make sure, is he the one that makes a snowstorm so that tomorrow I don't get to work on time? How does he do? Okay, that's a question. That's a big question that we'll delve into, but you don't have to explain that in depth to every person. The how of his providence. What does it mean when we say that God cares, has providence? He watches over us. He cares about what we do. He's concerned about it. Okay, that's a deep topic, which we'll discuss, but you don't have to teach that to everyone, right? The notion of his will. What does it mean when we say that God wants something or wants something to his apprehension, that he apprehends things that we do, and his knowledge of all that he knows? God knows everything. And likewise, the notion of prophecy and how it is that human beings can communicate with God. The notion of his names, when we say that God has a name, what does it mean? What exactly does each name describe? Though there are many, being indicative of one and the same thing, that he has all these names, but ultimately they all refer to God, right? It should be considered that all these are obscure matters. These, in fact, they are the mysteries of the Torah and the secrets that are mentioned in the books of the prophets. They are the matters that ought not be spoken except of in chapter headings, as we have mentioned, and only with individuals such as has been described. Okay. On the other hand, he's going to emphasize this again, the negation of the doctrine of the corporality of God and the denial of his having a likeness to created things Again, corporeality is the big deal to Rambam. It's the biggest deal there is. And if it's being subject to affections, right? In other words, negating those ideas that we can change God by what we do. That's a really big point. We're going to get to, but I want you to take little bits and pieces as we go through this, so that when Rambam builds on the idea of how prayer works, you understand how important it is to Rambam that you recognize that we don't do anything that changes God, right? Nothing that we do makes him change. It's a very important.
Are you referring to also changing the future? I mean, when you say nothing changes God, do you also mean changes our lives? It makes us healthier or not healthier? Is that what you mean by change God?
It won't change. Well, what we do, well, it doesn't affect. It's very hard to parse this out right. It doesn't affect what God does and how he runs his world. It doesn't affect anything. Anything about God doesn't change based on. Now, how does that work? Isn't there such a thing as reward and punishment? What does prayer do? What is Torah and mitzvah? What does it mean when we live? Why is it that the Torah seems so clear that when we live a good life, there's some sort of reward at the end, right? Which implies that if we didn't live a good life, then there is no reward at the end. So something's changing. These are very important.
I guess what I'm pushing is how can anybody ever believe you could change God? I mean, that's something. What would it mean to change God?
Well, if you take a very primitive notion of God, then you think that when I pray to him, God thinks, oh, now he's praying to me, so now I'm going to decide to do something else. Like I had thought the world should run like this, and he cried to me, and now I'm gonna change it. Now I'm gonna do something different, right? That's a very Rambam would not describe it that way, right? What does change when you pray? We're going to get there. That's not the topic of today's discussion. It's an idea. Rambam emphasizing this already for the third time in this chapter, right? I'm laying these seeds. That's how Rambam is going to work. He lays down these seeds so that as you study the book, you begin to develop the way he thinks through all of these issues.
How does the Rambam learn Nachum Ishkamzu?
Yeah, those are good questions. No, it's all of the parts of the Talmud that indicate or all in that someone prayed and therefore God changed and did something. Especially, I mean, that story, where he demanded of God. Rambam does explain those things, but I don't want to sound like I'm trying to pass off on the question. It's a good question. I promise we'll get there, but I'm laying down this seed because Rambam did it that way, right? But let's go into the discussion that he wants to go into now, which is so those ideas, right? The idea that God we have to deny any corporality of God, the denial that God has any way similarity to the things that he created, and that it's any way possible for the creations of God to change him to affect change in God. Those things ought to be made clear and explained to everyone according to his capacity, and ought to be inculcated in virtue of the traditional authority upon children, women. And forgive me if this is insulting to women, because he was insulting to women. Rambam thought women were they were just not on the same intellectual level, stupid ones, and those of a defective natural disposition. All right, or those, they're just too lazy or too whatever. It doesn't matter. Anyone, just as they adopt the notion that God is one, that he is eternal, and that none but he should be worshipped, they need to be told that God is not a body, and God is, and so on, those ideas. For there is no profession of unity unless you can't go walk around saying, I believe in one God, if you think that he's corporeal, right? Because if he's corporeal, right, a body cannot be one. It's composed of matter and form. That would have been Rambam's scientific explanation, right? But we would explain a body can't be one. It's made up of millions of different types of cells and different types of organs and different types of molecules and atoms, etc. It's not one, right? if God is one, God can't consist of a body. It's also divisible, subject to partition. And you go to medical school, you learn neurovascular physiology, you learn about the brain, you learn about the heart, you learn about how the lungs work. There's separate systems, and we can naturally divide it. But God is not that way. When people have received this doctrine, are habituated to and educated and grown up in it, and subsequently, now here's this little bit starts to sound a little bit more, what was the word you told me before, Jeff? Inclusive, right? A little bit more inclusive. And that is as follows. And then subsequently become perplexed over the text of the books of the prophets, then the meaning of these books should be explained to them. A person understands that God has no body, right? And then he starts to read where it says that God had an outstretched arm, right? And he asks you a question. This is really odd. What does it mean when it says that he has an outstretched arm? At that point, they should be elevated to the knowledge of the interpretation of these texts. So in other words, any person that demonstrates perplexity, and this book is the guide to the perplexed, right? So when the person says, wait, I don't quite understand, right? Then their attention should be drawn to the equivocality and the figurative sense of the various terms. Then you can start explaining the principles that I've been telling you, right? That these terms are meant to be taken in a figurative sense, right? And the terms doesn't necessarily mean exactly what always the same thing in the same context. In different contexts, it means different things. The exposition of which is contained in this treatise. So here you have the Rambam explicitly saying that the book is written for everyone, right? So those of us that read the beginning and think that the Rambam said this book is only written for the smart people, well, Rambam just said that anyone that knows that God is one, but then he starts reading something or seeing something and he's perplexed about it. Well, I wrote in this book the answer to those questions so that the correctness of their belief regarding the oneness of God and the affirmation of the truth of the books of the prophets should be saved, right? So once the person demonstrates that question, that is when that person deserves an answer to his or her question, right? But then you come up to the fact that some people, however, someone's mind fails to understand the interpretation of the text and the possibility of an identity of term going together with a difference in meaning. But then you have some people who simply won't get it. They're just too dumb, right? Or too stubborn, or too arrogant, or too uneducated, or too something. They just don't get it for whatever reason, right? Then he should be told, you know what? The interpretation of this text is understood by men of knowledge. Now, I'm not sure how psychologically this actually works, but when you tell a guy, if you tried, but the truth is, I can't help but think about this when it comes to certain debates that you have with someone who refuses to accept science that I know is true. Like, if no matter how much I tell them that, and then they'll ask you a question and then you start explaining it. And then sometimes you get to the point where they're just so stubborn. And then sometimes you just have to say, listen, I went to medical school for 4 years. I went 4 years in residency. I studied this all my life. I know what I'm talking about. Just listen to me because I know what I'm talking about, right? And that's what Rambam is saying here. And sometimes you get to that point where that's what you just have to do, because some people just, maybe it's not their fault, maybe they're just too dumb, but sometimes you just have to do it. You, however, right, you who's reading this book know that God, may he be honored and magnified, is not a body you're subject to affections. For affection is a change. Again, this is the fourth time he mentions this thing. God cannot be changed, and may he be exalted, is not touched by change. He is not like unto anything of all those that are other than he. You can't compare him to anything else, nor is he comprehended together with one of these things in any definition whatever. You know likewise that these dicta of the prophets are true and have an interpretation. You also know that what's written in the Torah is true, right? So in dealing with such a man, one should stop at this measure of knowledge. The person who just won't or can't listen, that's what you have to say, right? You just know it, that's it. But it is not meet that belief in the corporality of God or in his being provided with any concomitant of the body. It should be permitted to establish. But don't leave that conversation saying, you know what? If that's what you think, that's okay. Whatever the guy thinks walking out of this room or this Facebook discussion or wherever you're having this interaction, obviously you can't control what the guy thinks when he walks out of the room. But don't let him walk out of the room with you saying, it's okay if that's what you think. right? When it comes to these beliefs, because it's not okay if that's what you think. If you think God is a human being, then you're making such a big mistake that cannot be tolerated. It should not be allowed to establish itself in anyone's mind any more than admit that belief should be established in the non-existence of the deity, like that God doesn't exist at all, in the association of other gods with him, that there are more than one, or in the worship of anything other than God. Now, I have some ideas about what Rambam thinks about the non-existence of the deity. Obviously, Rambam makes it very, very clear, and he did in this chapter and in many till now, that you must believe in an existence of the deity, and that not believing in it is an intolerable belief. You're like, that's not something we should tolerate. But what it means that a person believes in God is something that, as we progress through the book, we're going to learn that it doesn't necessarily mean exactly what we've always thought it meant, right? So as a child, you're told you have to believe in God. You might have an image of God that's somewhat corporeal, right? So what you think God is has to grow as you become more educated and know more. And a lot of people who claim to be an atheist, who claim to not believe in God, what they're actually rejecting often are these more primitive notions of God, right? So they tell you, I don't believe in God, but what they're actually telling you they don't believe in are these primitive notions of God that Rambam himself is telling us not to believe in. Does that make any sense? Right? So I'm not going to speak for every atheist in the world, but I can speak for many. When you talk to them, you'll find that a lot of them are rejecting things that Maimonides would certainly reject as well. And this is it. Sometimes it's difficult because some people who are atheists identify with their atheism, like they strongly hold themselves as atheists. But if you carry on a conversation for long enough, you realize that we're really not that different in what we don't believe in. But this concept will develop itself as we go through, and as we hit the next chapter, 36. It'll be even more important to remember what I'm trying to say. But I want to. It's 36 is a little too long to start now, because if I start it now, then we're never going to finish, and it's really one thought. So I'd rather end with these thoughts. I want to just review real quick, like the points that he made. Right? That yes, it's true that most people will never really get to understand all of these great ideas, and that we shouldn't bother teaching them for all the reasons that he described in what we studied together last week. However, certain basic concepts need to be taught to everyone, right? No matter who they are, no matter how educated they are. And those basic concepts he listed as the basic things, as the negating the corporeality of God, negating the fact that God can be affected by us, and negating the fact that and making sure people understand that the difference between God and us is not just a difference in quantity, but it's a difference in quality. It's something completely different entirely. And then he said that the point where you begin to start teaching these ideas, but these other ideas, all of these lofty ideas that he listed, how God relates to the world, what does this mean? What does that mean? All that, those you can study with the people who have achieved the level or who are willing to go through the work necessary to understand it. And then he told us that once they're established with these truths that they accepted, we need to tell them, then if they start asking questions, you answer the questions. So Rambam never says to throw someone out unless you get to the point where the person can't or is not willing to learn. And that's the only time when Rambam says, just tell them it is what it is because it is what it is. And that's it. So first he says you teach, but then if that doesn't work, if someone's mind fails to understand, just tell them, you know what, this is the way it is. All right. So those are the ideas. And Dan, I saw you commented before about your daughter, and I want you to tell, if you don't mind, to tell us what exactly a little bit more details. I'm interested to hear a little bit more.
So she was in the Berman Hebrew Academy, and of course she was taught that God answers her prayers, right? And that there's a point to praying. And when people are sick, we say Tehillim. Mm-hmm. And then I believe she was assigned something to read from Maimonides. And when we came across this concept that no matter what you do, God doesn't change, right? She just burst into tears because the whole theology she had ever been taught was, God listens, God hears, God is merciful, and God will, will adjust what it does,
right?
Depending upon your actions. So she's like, why do I do all this stuff? Why do I pray? Why do I do mitzvot? Why? It was, when I say she's never recovered from, she has, to be very clear, those of you who know my daughter Leora, she is very devout, but she's a seeker and a questioner and wrestles with theology. And I think in part it was this challenge because she's like, wait a second, why am I doing all this stuff?
So Dan, what did you say to her to stop the crying?
I tried to explain to her that we do it because it benefits us, right? And
so it changes us, not God.
It changes us, right? Not that it changes God.
Yeah, it's hard for us as adults because it's painful to think that, we like to think when we're in a troubled situation that we have something that we can do to make it better, and if a person is sick, okay, I can go to the doctor, I can take the medicine, I can get the procedure or whatever it is. But beyond that, there's a certain amount of lack of control, right? And when someone believes in a more simple concept of prayer, that if I just pray, or on an even lower level than that, if I just do some sort of magical formulation, or I say this specific verse at this specific time of day 7 times or whatever, then I'll affect a change. It'll be better. And it gives you a sense of control over things. But the truth is that the ultimate level of humility and what we really should achieve with prayer is not that is exactly the opposite. Is really that prayer requires humility, right? Humility means that we recognize that we don't have control, that we recognize that we have to control the things that we can, but ultimately God has control and not us, right? And what does that, so whatever happens tomorrow or whatever happens from this, whatever situation you're in at the time is going to be a result of the way God created the world and the way he decided it's going to work and run. And these are ways that we can never understand, as Rambam keeps reminding us, that we don't understand the ways of God. And ultimately, when it initially sounds very scary, right? Because we're not going to get necessarily the results that we think are good or that we want. But if we believe in God's ultimate justice, right, then we'll be able to handle whatever gets thrown our way, even if, God forbid, that which happens is awful. And you learn this when you read, with the people that speak about the awful, horrific horrors that they endured and how they maintained faith in God. Is full acceptance of God means that my prayer might not work because, and work in the sense that I want it to, and it takes a tremendous amount of humility to recognize that I don't control God, that I can't make him do anything. And that's what prayer is really meant to do. It's meant to help us deal with the situation and give us the strength we need to get through it. And ultimately give us the strength so that we can do the things that we can do, right? Once you recognize that humility, now I could, by the way, the ideas I'm expressing, obviously I've drawn from many places in my education, but very much from Maimonides and from my study of Maimonides, so.
Can I ask you one question?
Sure, of course.
Most Jews are like Dan's wonderful daughter, who I had the privilege of hearing at our show. And if what you've said were communicated to the Jewish community, there'd be a lot of crying Jews, because we're taught and we most believe that somehow, some way, God does hear your prayers, and somehow it can change what.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and first of all, there are many Jews that avoid studying this book. This part of the reason, right, is because this is a scary thought. Rambam himself hinted towards this. When we had I'll have to find the reference. I don't remember the exact chapter, but it was where he was discussing the carbonot. Remember, at one point I was jumping ahead a few times. I decided kind of just to stick with Rambam's program and each time just to move forward in the text rather than jump around. But like, I don't know, about 10 lectures ago, I was still doing that. And one time I segued off into his discussion of carbonot, right, of the sacrifices. And he described there how God couldn't just come down and tell everyone, don't do sacrifices, right? So he kind of eased us into it, right? So, and one of his examples, he mentioned it kind of off the cuff as a little side comment, but the side comment was super powerful. And his side comment was, right, that God couldn't come down and imagine if God would tell us, you know, your prayers are meaningless because you can't just pray for something and then get it, right? So he didn't tell us that. He said, you know what, go ahead, pray for things, right? Because if God would have come down in those times and just said, prayer is meditation, is this connecting yourself, it's all this lofty stuff, but it's not about, you know, asking God for something and he gives it to you, right? Then no one would have wanted it. No one would have listened to it. So he had to ease us into it, right? So Rambam made that comment. I have to find it again, exactly the quote. I'll give it to you, but we did study it together. And it's like, he says it in such an off the cuff, quick way that you can almost miss it. But it's such a powerful statement, you know, where he says right then and there, you know, that God understands that, you know what, some people have to go about believing that that's the case, that they can pray and then God will fix it, you know.
So are we to come away from this meeting as we prepare for the high holidays and Yom Kippur, that when we say over and over again, prayer, repentance, prayer for repentance and charity can remove the harshness of the decree, that we are saying something that just is not true?
No, I think that's beautiful. I'm glad you brought this. It's a great way to end. I'm not necessarily that we need to end. We could have more discussion. But thank you for bringing that up, because I made this observation a while ago, and I believe it's very my manadian. Teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah are not three separate things that can bring about the ending of the evil decree, right? They're in order for a reason, right? Teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, one leads to the other, right? It ends teshuvah, recognizing who we are, recognizing our faults, in other words, being humble. Teshuvah is essentially being humble. That's step one. And I just said this before, and I'm just paraphrasing it in a different way, using the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah that you quoted. Tefillah, prayer. When you're humble, you can now approach God and recognize that you can control it, that you're nothing. And then what does one do, right? One acts righteously. One does tzedakah, which is much more than just giving charity, which of course is part of it. But tzedakah means being righteous, right? Which is ultimately what God wants from us. That takes away the Ro'ah HaGezerah, because God constructed a world in which when people act good and just and kind towards themselves and towards each other, right, the evil decrees go away. And think about what that means and how powerful that is. In other words, prayer is what gives you the strength, gives us as human beings the strength to make the world better, right? Will it end all disease? No. But just imagine if we all acted righteously, how many people would have died of COVID? Would it have been 1 million Americans died of COVID, or would it have been 100,000 Americans died of COVID? If we all acted righteously, right? In other words, if we all really did practice the things that doctors advised from the beginning, right? If we really did all get the vaccine when it was put out, right? And not listen to nonsense. If we all really did follow, appropriate, if we all were healthy enough and hadn't, been 200 pounds overweight and eating ridiculous diets and making us have all these these problems that made us more predisposed towards being more sick. If we all would have practiced tzedakah, we would have had a world with a gezerah that would have been a lot better, right? This is how the world is constructed. Teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, according to the Rambam, means be humble. Tefillah, approach God and recognize that God constructed the world this way, and then do tzedakah. That's how you get rid of it. The prayer becomes a tremendous, it's a very spiritual thing. It's extremely spiritual to recognize that God is the one that created the world this way, and that it's not for me to change. And only after one is humble, one can then go ahead and live the way God commanded us to live and do the things he told us to do. And ultimately, this is the Rambam's idea of what tefillah and prayer is about. I went way ahead of myself, but because I did say in the beginning that we weren't going to discuss what prayer is, but we just did. But I'd rather, but think of what I'm saying now as we go through chapter by chapter by chapter in the Rambam, and these ideas are going to come out more and more and more beautifully and more and more and more clearly as he drops, like he keeps saying, these little hints, these what he calls the Roshei Prakim, the heads of chapters, little ideas that he drops out, and it's a hard concept to explain to a child. It's a really hard concept to do that, but it's something that we should do. I see there's a hand. Jeff, go ahead.
So how does Rambam understand? How do we understand, or how would we understand what Rambam would understand from the prayer Shomea Tefillah, right? We say, blessed are you who hears prayer, right? Or hears the prayer of man. So how does that fit into this interpretation? And more broadly, I mean, maybe your explanation answers this question, but what I was thinking before is, why then are we commanded to pray? Like we're commanded to pray. So if prayer is not really, I mean, is that just to benefit us? Is that just a good for us, but it really doesn't affect?
It doesn't affect God, and it is good for us. Prayer is still very good for us, right? Even in in Rambam's explanation, it's good for us because, well, it does help make our world better, and it also helps us get out of our problems, but not in the magical way, not in the way of and when we say that God hears our prayer, you have to come on to Rambam already explained he told us he's going to tell us what does it mean when God hears, right? These are concepts. What does it mean that God sees? What does it mean that God has providence over this world? Those Rambam listed them in today's chapter. These are ideas that we're going to study in this book, right? What does it mean when I say that, God is angry? What does it mean that God loves? What does it mean that he has mercy? I know there's a class that's going to start in 15 minutes on the Yud Gimel Midos, his attributes, right? Rambam talks about the Yud Gimel Midos and at length, and we're going to do that. He's going to talk about it. Starts, I think it's chapter like 59 of the first chapter, where he talks about all these ideas. I mean, it would be hard to summarize everything, but in an answer to that question, because it's a very important question. But we'll see. I promise.
I'll stay tuned. Maybe at least it qualifies me not for the completely ignorant category by asking the question.
Right. No, it qualifies you as one who's perplexed. These are the questions that Rambam commanded us to answer, those that ask such questions. So I'm not passing on the question, I promise.
I have a question. It seems like the way that Rambam is writing this is that there are many people that share his beliefs at the same time. But this seems to be like a great revelation to most of us, I guess, that were attending this class. Were there other people at the same time that shared Maimonides' philosophy?
Well, I would tend to. I don't think you're right when you said that it seems that this was a belief, that the Rambam is expressing things that most people believe. I think Rambam is expressing these ideas, and most people in his time did not believe these ideas, right? In other words, Rambam was writing this book because too many people understood God in a much more simplistic way, and he wanted to teach that. And the ideas of Rambam are certainly not new. He's certainly not the only person to say them, but it reflects Rambam's his rationalism in the sense that he studied philosophy and he wanted to apply that same rationalistic approach, and he hit the Torah and a lot of the things that people believed and a lot of the apparent meanings of passages in the Torah and in the Talmud seemed to contradict what he rationalistically thought. And then he ended up getting perplexed like we are. But I'm not sure if most people in Rambam's time, and probably most people in today's time, if you ask them what Jews think about prayer, they'll think that if you pray, you'll get what you want. They'll admit that, sometimes you don't really get exactly what you want. You pray for that job, you don't get the job, but next week you'll get another job and it'll have been better. So God answered your prayer in ways that you didn't, expect. I think that's the answer you get from most people, but Rambam would definitely not agree. He might say that you prayed for the job and then you thought to yourself, you recognized and realized through your humility, you were able to recognize your faults. And you realized, when I wrote that resume, I did a crummy job, and I shouldn't have been so lazy. I should have called my other friend that I have in this other place who knows somebody that might be able to do it. And you did the legwork and you got the other job, and prayer helped because it was through your humility and your ability to look at yourself and criticize what you've done wrong in the past and find a way to improve it. So you got the job, that's how Rambam would explain it. And so prayer definitely helped, but not in the magical way that people think of it. It was important that you went to shul. It was important that you had that humility, but you needed to go through the process and then you managed to find the solution. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. But I have a question, kind of a holdover question from last week. I asked you I asked you about a question of morality and what was considered virtuous, and you said you had humility, I believe, was what you told me.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other? There must be other virtues. You can't build a whole ethical system out of humility, can you?
Well, sure, there are other ethical virtues, and we will, Rambam will talk about them. But the mercy, fairness, justice, kindness, but I do think that ultimately it does boil down to humility. I think that humility is really the basis of all virtue. That's my own opinion. You can put that when someone wants to quote me one day. but I do believe that and when you see it in the you see it in the prophets all the time. Like I quoted from Micah before, that's the bottom line, is to walk humbly before God. And if you're humble, then you can accept that you don't know everything, you don't control everything, you can't control everything, all you can do is the best you can do, and you're constantly willing to criticize yourself, to accept criticisms from other people. And that's the only way to improve. That's the only way to be a better person. That's the only way the world can be a better place. If we all were willing to recognize that our philosophies, our ideas, the things that we stood up for, the things that we might have rallied for once upon a time, maybe I was all wrong. I have to be able to challenge myself, and that all requires humility. We can't get anywhere without humility. I'm sorry, I'm not even talking Maimonides. I'm just going off on my own thing, so I'll stop. But yeah, anyone else want to add anything before we close up for the night? If not, then I think to next week we'll have a really interesting chapter. We'll do 36 together, and then after that, I'm just giving you a little preview. After that, Rambam goes back to doing terms again. Remember, he was doing all the Hebrew terms, and then after going back to all the Hebrew terms, he's going to go into attributes a bit, and that's going to be a lot of fun. In the terms, on the surface, it seems a little bit less fun, but I promise you we'll draw fun things out there too. And then he bounces back to attributes, and then he talks a little bit about the affecting God. We were just talking about now the prayer issue. So he as his usual pattern of bouncing around, he'll keep doing that. So have a good evening. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.